So welcome to this award event for the 2024 Jon Stallworthy Poetry Prize. My name is Julie Curtis, and for many years as a Fellow of Wolfson College specialising in Russian literature, I had the privilege and the pleasure of knowing Jon Stallworthy right up until his untimely death in 2014. He was a dear friend and colleague to many of us, a distinguished academic professor of English, the author of many books, including studies of W.B. Yeats, Wilfred Owen, Louis MacNeice, the editor of important anthologies of English literature. And above all, he was a wonderful poet in his own right, with 7 volumes to his name. And some of you have already written to me to say that you've discovered Jon Stallworthy's poetry because of the competition, so that's lovely to hear. Jon was also infinitely interested in the writing of others. He nurtured many young talents and was a very generous reader of and commenter on draft manuscripts. After Jon Stallworthy's death in 2014, the then president of Wolfson College, Professor Dame Hermione Lee, set up the Jon Stallworthy Poetry Prize to honour his memory as a poet, and also because he was a much valued fellow of this college. With the kind approval of the family of Jon Stallworthy's close friend, the poet Seamus Heaney, a fund in the English faculty which was associated with Heaney was combined with other funding to launch the prize in 2016. And we're delighted that fundraising and efforts and generous donations since then have now secured the endowment of the prize in perpetuity. The purpose of the prize is to give an opportunity for Oxford's postgraduate students to submit their works in an annual competition which runs alongside the very long established, very famous Newdigate Prize, which is only open to undergraduate members of the university. Each poet may submit up to 2 poems, not more than 40 lines in length, and the prize is hosted and run jointly by Wolfson College and the English faculty at Oxford. Each year, the shortlisted poems are published in a booklet. Some of you have got copies of them in a small print run edition. And if you would like to read these booklets, you can find them in the English Faculty Library and in Wolfson Library. Since its inception, one of the competition judges has been Jon's close friend, the poet and professor of English, Bernard O'Donoghue. His first fellow judge was Simon Armitage, then Alice Oswald, and now for the first time, Alicia Stallings. All of them hold the title of the Professor of Poetry at the University of Oxford. Their insights and their authority have provided a wonderful framework for the prize competition. Up until now, we have held the competition every year on the 18th of January, which was Jon's birthday, and that's today is one of those days. So we remember him very affectionately this evening, knowing how much he would have relished the talented writings that the competition has elicited. So amongst my thanks, I'd like to acknowledge Professor Dame Hermione Lee and her successor as president of Wolfson, Sir Tim Hitchens, Professors Simon Armitage, Alice Oswald, Alicia Stallings, come on in, and Professor Bernard O'Donoghue, the faculty board chairs and administrators of the English faculty. Hello, do come in. This year, my particular thanks go to Hope Lukanamoy, who has been extremely efficient and helpful with the arrangements for the competition. She created also a very beautiful poster. So thank you very much, Hope, for all your support. And I'd like to thank Steve Pearce of Filmshed for providing the technical support. I'd like to hand over now to Sir Tim Hitchens, who'd also like to say a few introductory words before we hear the poems.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Julian. It's always one of the wonderful evenings of the year when we hear these great poets. And it's a great occasion to say happy birthday to Jon. And I'm extremely pleased also that we have for the first time the new Oxford Professor of Poetry joining the panel. And we look forward to hearing from her later on. Well, as always, I'm lucky enough to get a sneak preview of the poems being considered tonight, and as you'll know, all of them are working on the theme of borders. There are plenty of ideas in there relating to borders. There are crests of hills, there are edges of water, there's a torn-off edge of old England, there are hinges, there are being on the wrong side of a fault line which splits a country in two. So borders, as you'd expect, appear everywhere in these poems. One poem that struck me talked about the wild grey shores of language, which suggests maybe a link between language itself and borders and edges. And I read a phrase, the ends of our words, which prompted me, I suspect on purpose, to think about the ends of our worlds and the connection between those two things. Our poets play with the edges of poetic lines, phrases falling off one line to restart on the next, or else the words themselves question our assumptions about the borderlines between one word and the next, compressing what we expect to be two words into a single new creation, myth sand or rabbit cratered. As always, like great poems, they make us think and they challenge us to frame our world very differently. So thank you all for taking part. Thank you for coming tonight. And I hope you enjoy these poems as much as I have done. Thank you.
I should have said too that this year we've had 53 submissions. That's lower than last year, but that's because we cut the numbers of poems that people were able to submit from 3 per person to 2 per person. The quality was extremely high. We're really very thrilled with what we had to read. So I'm now going to invite each of the 6 shortlisted poets in alphabetical order of surname to read out their poems, and that should match what you have in your programme. So Grace, could I ask you to come and start, please?
Hello, I'm Grace. I'm from Sunderland. I'm currently studying for an MSc in creative writing at Somerville College. And the poem I'm going to be reading tonight is called Voiced. It's a poem to the northeast. Here we are, at the torn-off edge of old England, where vowels awake in the shafts of miners' grey mouths, pitmatic caught in their teeth like pith to pick out with a fingernail on the way home, singing "Ne mer to your dotty old heap will I come." Where mams gather winds for their shh, for the tide song will soothe the bubbling bairns. Wrinkled shipwrights chase after shantyman dreams, rolling their R's up the banks of the weir, tripping and twirling them run the rubble of them old days. Hooded teas duck behind headstones in mere knolls. They shy inland, voiceless as the buried, gulp down kisses like dry pills. Woos are reserved for the lips of Park Lane smokers, whistling singed woes into the wind. They have asked her 100 times for direction, only for her to whisper back, "It is too cold to linger anywhere loveless." Here we are, snagging on our own corners, swallowing debris, waiting on a word to start again, and all the while unsung, bereft of crescendo. Here, where the deck cranes come now to die, here, at the wild grey shores of language, cut off by God walking past, the ends of our words, welding sparks blown on the wind. And yet here we are, in this ghost town republic of sound, sung for, singing still, for music can't be mispronounced. Hear that? Here we are. Here we are. Thank you.
Hello everyone, I'm Riley. I'm at Worcester College studying a Masters of World Literatures in English. I'd like to dedicate this poem to my grandfather, my papa, Gordon. He really deeply loved the place that this poem arose from. And also I'd like to acknowledge that that place is the country, the unceded country of the Binjarab Noongar people in what's now called Western Australia. And I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present. Self-slip. Make the journey to Bouvard, taking the long way round the estuary's southern end, where sun shocks and hazes at the crest of tallest hill, on its track over forest and lakes to an ocean of sand. Arriving, the greeting sight is unexpected. two men are perched by a campfire at the edge of autumn water. Suspicion. People use these frontages of brown water for diverse ends. Some traipse shallows in long slaughter, heaving crabs from with weed to mar evening with cook fires, crushing evidence in sand above the mudline. These men, though, wear dryness, watching stratified cloud set on which pale orange holds in pre-retribution. Walk barefoot to them, over puddled water gathered by rain and topography onto greyed sand, once bush, once grass, and now, for a stretching long while, duck-dug, rabbit-crated precarity, where Samphire has inched from in beside estuary to far beyond what high tide lines once were and are. Careful of these figures, hunched in confident non-ownership of the edge. This is not their where, and that intensifies felt right to it. Land by water is always slipping states. Without vast long roots and rhizomes to remake soil of salt sand, stability and property are simple myth sand. In this eroding estuarine liminality, edges are only dictated by mind work and moon. In long tree shadow, these men may well be sitting on what will soon also be territory of water and a new tragedy of commons, one where all living things must still or more beware. Crumbled certainty, where ends, who owns sand, leads to urgent claim of all claimable, water held or weed. In sketched ownership, why are you justified to dole tough move-ons to those implicated no more than you? Long for men by water to not actually be there. Outlines long faded or elusively sand. Your instincts are shifting. Go on.
Hi everyone, I'm Harry, I'm from Ayr, Scotland. I'm studying for an MST in creative writing and I'm at Somerville College. This poem was written after a week in France with the boys where we shucked a lot of oysters. The Oyster Locksmith. A blunt knife angled towards the hinge. I wiggle and chip its pits, punt them into the nerveless chasm. This dazzling creature conned into sucking the sea's bad bits before the strike and shuck. A firm push towards finding the groove and letting the needle drop into the smooth gape, pearled by a single mush of fresh death.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming and listening. I'm Lauren. I am in the MST History of Art and Visual Cultures program at Wolfson College, so this is great. And my poem is called You Want to Write Family Poems. You want to write family poems, but all you can talk about is love. While somewhere 50 years ago, a great uncle dies, a martyr for his pear trees. It's not his fault his feet were planted on the wrong side of a quickening fault line, that they split a country in two so you could die of lymphoma in a different continent than your grandmother. When you went back for the first time, they turned a restaurant into a pizza parlor. It would be funnier if the neon sign didn't make a green halo over your mother's head, and also if her mother were still alive. The corner store was the same as always. You palmed the same quick cake you did when you were 9, stowed it in your pocket all the plane ride home, just to hear the last of the funerary ceremony over the phone. After, went driving in Gameland countryside, watched the horses hang their heads over the fences, remembered the unfinished portrait in your closet of a glistening white mare with just its barest muscle, remembered how it was meant for someone 4 years ago, remembered she was born in the year of the horse, remembered you should have given it to her the last time. Thank you.
Good evening. I'm Jordan Molly Preuss. I'm studying at Merton College for a DPhil in classics. My area is ancient Greek epic. In earlier forms of English, it was possible not only to be ruthless, but to take compassion upon someone by taking Ruth. This poem has in view both a woman from the Gospels who seeks healing from Christ and the figure named Ruth in the Hebrew Bible. Taking Ruth. I also meant to stretch and touch him, but my hand was shy of stepping past the line. So when I felt her pressing at me shut behind a box of backs, and one was mine, I leaned to let her reach him, since she seemed to know the way. Though threshing bodies swept her flailing to the bottom of their stream, her outflung fingers foundering at his feet, she found his mantle, clutched it, moored her hand beneath its bounds, and when he stopped and turned and saw the woman on the ground, a strand of new gleaned wool clasped in her palm, she learned she'd touched him. Slipping down onto his knee, "You're safe," he said, "because you trusted me."
I'm Sam. I'm reading for a Master's in American Literature. David Lean in Almeria. Watching the flurry of desperate pigeons in the white buildings, he knew that he was sick, that the desert was doing him no good, the tricks the world played on him. In the bar, we hear that his young wife still lives in solitude among the always flowering bougainvillea. We are just down from her, and the door swings open for a newcomer. The light flares and dies, and we guess she had been long-suffering Virgilia to the conquest of his images. In his barren landscape, we know, nothing fits. Well, we do what we shouldn't, and now spend our time talking about them with whatever else we've managed to dredge up in a dark bar in this long, treacherous summer. Thanks.
Well, that was wonderful to hear that variety of voices and strategies and aesthetics, and everyone read so well, which is not always the case. I would just like to do a hand for everybody. I'm lucky to have one of the strangest poetry jobs in the world. I feel very blessed, and surely one of the best parts of this job must be the giving of prizes and the learning about new poets and new poems, and maybe even helping bring some new poems in the world by offering a topic. It was a great pleasure to work with Julie and Bernard. We had a wonderful conversation about these poems and about poetry in general. So this was very generative in many ways. When asked to propose a topic for the Stallworthy Prize this past summer, the word that first slipped into my mind was borders. I live in Greece, where borders are always in the news. I am a translator, a profession where we try to smuggle meaning across borders of language. And as a classicist of sorts, I am aware of the shifting of borders throughout history. Migration is perhaps one of the most ancient and ironically defining of human activities, yet walls being built at national borders to exclude one set of people and, in theory, protect another, cost human lives and have the unforeseen consequence of interrupting millennia-old migratory patterns and paths of wildlife at a time when nature needs more consideration from us, not less. Something there is that doesn't love a wall, as an American poet has said. The invisible borders writ on water and the sea are a treacherous place where many drown. Death itself is an undiscovered country, as Shakespeare reminds us in Hamlet's phrase, "From whose bourne no traveler returns." Many of our entrants chose to confront political and national borders in their poems, sometimes to very moving effect. One of the most nuanced of the long-listed texts was the poem Disintegration, about not only the borders crossed by immigration, but borders between generations of immigrants and even within racial distinctions in the same family, a poem admired by the judges for its verve, and verbs. But I chose Borders also for its wide and varied application. Borders between individuals, the borders of language, the borders of a garden plot or a plowed field or a painting or an embroidered robe, the border of time between one year and the next. I hoped we would see entries negotiating the whole range of border and bordering. Poems of the short list, in no particular order, include Grace Copeland's Voiced, a delightful meditation on borders via linguistics, exploring voiced sounds as both demonstration and metaphor for people and place. This poem is full of unusual music, wit, and surprising figures of speech, as we just heard in Grace's wonderful reading. Hooded teas duck behind headstones in Mayor Knowles, the shy inland, voiceless as the buried, gulp down kisses like dry pills. We were won over by Jordan Maliprusa's sonnet, Taking Ruth. And I really liked hearing about the title because that was one of the things that slightly puzzled us. In fact, I think I even say here, a more pertinent title might have made that decision easier and faster. I now understand that title better, so I might have to adjust these remarks. A sonnet about which I took to be from the story in Luke, the incident of the bleeding woman, I assume from endometriosis, who touches the hem of Jesus' robe and is healed. But now I understand the gleaning and the harvest of the Ruth reference. So I really appreciated learning about that. While accomplished in its meter and rhyming, this sonnet addressing a biblical subject, the poem hews to modern diction in imaginative, figurative language and demonstrates through its own enjambments and reach how this is a poem about crossing boundaries as the woman stretches out her hand and grasps the robe without permission. But it is by this transgression, paradoxically, an act of faith, that she is healed. In You Want to Write Family Poems by Lauren Lee, we have what Edward C. Corral calls an on-ramp title, going right into that contrary but of the opening line. In this free verse poem, the judges were attracted to the detail and specificity of this narrative, the jagged rift of space, the fault line that opens in the middle of the poem could have been clever or tricksy, but I think it earns its special visual effect. Here we have the border of a country split in two, which of course also is a split in time, a division in human lives. Details include a piece of funeral cake spirited into a pocket for the plane ride home, but there's attention to language throughout. I loved the wording and music of horses hang their heads over the fences. The Oyster Locksmith by Harry Ledgerwood is perhaps the most borderline in its pitch as a borders poem of the shortlist, but also one of the finest entries as a poem in a strong field. The judges decided that the shucking of a hinged bivalve was thematic enough. Strong, rather Heaney-esque descriptive language, words with heft and texture, and language with imaginative leaps. The picking of the oyster's lock, the drop of the needle as onto a vinyl LP, even that nice, smooth, pearled, and the mush of death tickle the ear's fancy as well as the imagination, the job of a lyric poem. We come now to our runner-up, David Lean and Almeria by Samuel Rigg. Likewise came at the theme by an intriguing slant and began with immediate authority, pulling me right into its world. Both judges enjoyed the unusual subject matter, the sense of place, and the allusion to history at one remove by the centering of the production of the great film of Lawrence of Arabia's life and the movie's local aftermath. The language was spare and controlled, and the poem travels a lot of ground in 4 quatrains, managing to be both highly specific and with its first-person plural chorus, villagers, expats, suggestively mysterious. You will have realized now that our winning entry is by Riley Faulds. Congratulations. Riley comes with his posse of fans. Our winning entry by Riley Falls grappled with borders in more ways than one, but also with a confidence and technical assurance for which it stood out, even from the second excellent poem by the same entrant. Its title, Self-Slip, prepares us for the border between individuals, but very quickly we are directed to make the journey to Bouvard and find ourselves in an estuary, the shifting border between land and sea, salt water and fresh. I was taken in by the simple authority of its Audenesque imperative opening. I am thinking of Auden's Atlantis, itself influenced by Cavafy's Ithaca, and the subsequent winding and jammed syntax of the first sentence over the borders of the lines themselves. Make the journey to Bouvard, taking the long way round the estuary's southern end, where sun shocks and hazes at the crest of tallest hill, on its track over forests and lakes to an ocean of sand. The language is straightforward and I would say vernacular, but with a shimmer of poetic observation and ending in that paradox of ocean of sand. Not long into the poem, one notices that certain words at the ends of lines repeat or rhyme and that these keep reshuffling. Yes, it is a sestina. Often the heart sinks at this realization. They are often more fun to write than to read. And those of you who are blessedly innocent and don't know what a sestina is, I think there are probably very few people here who are in that blessed ignorance. But it's a 39-line poem with 6 stanzas where the ends of the 6 lines repeat in a certain order. And the problem with writing a sestina, I think, is not that we have these repeating words, but that it is a 39-line poem. So you have to have something to say. It's a page and a halfer. But this is one of the finest sestinas I have read for some time, one in which the form and content are perfectly matched, as the border of the right-hand justification is made, shuffled, and remade, a physical evocation on the page of the edge of sands and the rhythms of the tide. Further, the poem addresses not only the shifting border of the estuary, but how such shifting land water is the site of some shifty human activity. Out of the landscape evolve questions of who belongs where, what belongs to whom. The poem even finds its way into addressing larger issues of climate change and shifting sea levels, all without devolving into the didactic or the heavy-handed, that the poem jams into the envoy, the syntax again, crossing the border not only of line but stanza, and exits on another confident but gentle imperative. Go on. Persuades me as to the piece's completeness and elegance. It was a great pleasure taking part in this. I think Riley needs to come up and receive his wonderful certificate. Thank you very much. Could we ask you to
Wow. Thank you so much. I'm really glad that my name was pulled out of the hat because it means I get to read my poem for all the friends that turned up halfway through the first reading. So that's really nice. Yeah, it was a real pleasure to hear the other 5 poems tonight. Incredible poems, and yeah, looking forward to discussing them with you. So here is Self-Slip again. Self-Slip. Make the journey to Bouvard, taking the long way round the estuary's southern end, where sun shocks and hazes at the crest of tallest hill, on its track over forest and lakes to an ocean of sand. Arriving, the greeting sight is unexpected. 2 men are perched by a campfire at the edge of autumn water. Suspicion. People use these frontages of brown water for diverse ends. Some traipse shallows in long slaughter, heaving crabs from with weed to mar evening with cook fires, crushing evidence in sand above the mudline. These men, though, wear dryness, watching stratified cloud set on which pale orange holds in pre-retribution. Walk barefoot to them, over puddled water gathered by rain and topography onto greyed sand. Once bush, once grass, and now, for a stretching long while, duck-dug, rabbit-crated precarity, where sandfire has inched from in beside estuary to far beyond what high tide lines once were and are. Careful of these figures, hunched in confident non-ownership of the edge. This is not their where, and that intensifies felt right to it. Land by water is always slipping states. Without vast long roots and rhizomes to remake soil of salt sand, stability and property are simple myths, and in this eroding estuarine liminality, edges are only dictated by mind work and moon. In long tree shadow, these men may well be sitting on what will soon also be territory of water, and a new tragedy of commons, one where all living things must still, or more, beware. Crumbled certainty, where ends who owns sand, leads to urgent claim of all claimable, water held or weed. In sketched ownership, why are you justified to dole tough move-ons to those implicated no more than you? Long for men by water to not actually be there, outlines long faded or elusively sand. Your instincts are shifting. Go on.
Well, thank you again, Riley, for a really wonderful poem, which you've enjoyed. I must say personally, if I'm allowed to say this, I've enjoyed the shortlisted poems as a group this year, I think more than any other preceding year. It's been an absolutely terrific set of poems this year. Can I also thank Alicia for speaking so eloquently, and she has spoken on behalf of both the judges tonight. Bernard and she have consulted at great length about this. One of the things that I've particularly enjoyed about the entries in this year's theme of borders has been the extent to which the shortlisted poets themselves and their poems have crossed national borders as poets from several different national backgrounds, exploring different languages and cultures across imaginary or real borders. When I arrived at Wolfson over 30 years ago as a Russian lecturer, I was delighted to discover in Jon Stallworthy someone who, without knowing any Russian at all, had explored and relished Russian culture to the extent that he was already, with the help of good friends such as Peter France, the author of masterful translations of Russian poets such as Alexander Blok. And I'd like to round off today by sharing with you an extract from Jon Stallworthy's long poem, The Nutcracker, which was published in 1987. It's the story of a young diplomat who falls passionately in love with a dancer in Moscow at the height of Stalin's terror in the 1930s. He's parted from her by the Second World War and meets her again when it's far too late. The poem celebrates the overcoming of boundaries to begin with Gagarin's first venture into space in 1961. But it also bewails the harshness of the borders which keep the lovers apart. The poem is dedicated to Sir Isaiah Berlin, the founding president of Wolfson College, who, as a Russian-speaking diplomat, had a couple of celebrated encounters with the poet Anna Akhmatova in the 1940s and then in the 1960s. But Jon's poem also celebrates the way poetic forms can fly over national borders. When he wrote this poem in 1987, he had just recently finished editing the Indian writer Vikram Seth's marvelous novel in verse, The Golden Gate, which had adopted the unique stanzaic form used by the Russian poet Alexander Pushkin for his own novel in verse, Yevgeny Onegin, which was transformed into a wonderful opera by Tchaikovsky, the composer of the Nutcracker Ballet, which gave Jon's poem its title. And of course, like Vikram Seth and like Pushkin, Jon adopted the Onegin stanza of a particular witty, very fluent form for his poem, The Nutcracker, as you will hear. So in this part of the poem, the protagonist as war looms, hastily resigns from the diplomatic service and flies back to England, hoping to be interviewed for a job as a Moscow correspondent for a newspaper so he can go back again. There was no interview. I landed as Russia caught fire from the Black Sea to the Baltic. I was stranded. No job, no visa, no way back. Conscripted between ice and fire. My letters to Tatiana via the diplomatic bag brought no reply, her footprints filled with snow. Snow burying a U-boat chaser off Archangel, the snows of 4 pitiless winters. When the war was over, I went back to trace her, found nothing but a bombed-out flat. Came home, found you, and that was that. So thank you all for joining us this evening. There are drinks in the cafe. Please come and meet the poets, talk to them about their wonderful texts, and we look forward to seeing you here next year. Thank you very much.